Hollywood has spent a century painting a portrait of a tragic seductress, a woman defined only by her influence over men. That image is a fiction. The truth of Cleopatra VII is far sharper, far colder, and far more dangerous. She was not a pawn in a game of desire, but a master diplomat who navigated the collapse of empires with the precision of a chess player. Born into the Ptolemaic dynasty in 69 BCE, she was raised in the intellectual heart of Alexandria, a city where the air smelled of papyrus and sea salt. While others of her station sought luxury, she spent her hours in the great library, mastering mathematics, philosophy, and strategy. She commanded 9 languages with native fluency, allowing her to speak directly to the diverse subjects of her kingdom without the filter of a translator. She was the final shield of an ancient world, a sovereign who understood that power was not held by beauty, but by the ability to calculate, to negotiate, and to survive. The legend of the seductress is a convenient lie. The reality of the strategist is the history that actually shaped the Mediterranean. The death of her father shattered the fragile peace of the palace. Ptolemy XIII, only 10 years old, became the puppet of advisors who viewed the throne as their personal prize. They moved with calculated speed, purging her allies and stripping her of authority. Within weeks, the corridors of the palace turned hostile. She was not merely sidelined, she was hunted. The advisors forced her out of Alexandria, pushing her into the unforgiving heat of the Syrian desert. The transition from royal comfort to the grit of the frontier was absolute. She traveled with a small, loyal guard, sleeping on the hard earth and drinking from stagnant wells. Every mile away from the capital was meant to be the end of her reign, but the desert did not break her. Instead, the isolation sharpened her focus. She spent her nights mapping the routes back to the Nile, and her days recruiting soldiers from the border tribes. She traded gold for loyalty and promises for steel. She was building an army, and her eyes were fixed on the throne that was rightfully hers. The palace gates were sealed. Her brother's soldiers stood watch, a wall of iron and indifference that kept her from the capital. She knew that a direct assault would be suicide. She needed a way inside that no one would suspect. She found a merchant, a man with a cart full of coarse hemp sacks, and made her choice. She climbed into the center of a heavy, woven bag, the fibers scratching against her skin as the merchant pulled the drawstrings tight. Darkness swallowed her. She felt the cart lurch forward, the rhythmic clatter of wooden wheels on stone, and the muffled voices of the guards. At one point, the cart stopped. A spear tip prodded the sack, the metal biting into the fabric inches from her shoulder. She held her breath, muscles locked, listening to the guards' heavy boots retreat. The cart moved again, deeper into the palace, until it stopped in the private chambers of Julius Caesar. The merchant untied the knots. The sack fell away. She did not crawl out as a beggar or a supplicant. She stood, catching the Roman general's gaze, with a steady, calculated intensity. In that single, breathless moment, the power dynamic of Egypt had been rewritten. She was a queen, reclaiming her seat. The Roman legions moved with mechanical precision, clearing the path to the throne. Her brother's forces, once arrogant and entrenched, crumbled under the weight of disciplined infantry. The decisive clash occurred near the riverbanks, where the chaos of the retreat turned fatal. Ptolemy XIII vanished into the churning currents of the Nile, his claim to the throne extinguished in the silt and water. With the primary obstacle removed, the palace doors swung open for her return. She did not merely occupy the seat of power, she redefined it. Under her command, the administration underwent a radical transformation. She bridged the divide between the Greek-speaking elite and the local population, weaving their traditions into a singular, cohesive identity. She traveled the country, appearing in the temples as the living embodiment of Isis, a move that solidified her support among the priesthood and the common people alike. The economy stabilized as trade routes reopened, and the intellectual life of Alexandria surged. Libraries expanded, and scholars flocked to the city. The kingdom, once fractured by civil strife, entered a period of profound cultural and religious revival. The news arrived in the dead of night, carried by a rider whose horse collapsed at the palace gates. Julius Caesar was dead. The Roman Senate had turned, and the man who had served as the bedrock of her foreign policy lay in a pool of his own blood. The stability she had cultivated for years evaporated in an instant. In the halls of the palace, the silence was replaced by the frantic clatter of armor. She did not wait for the dust to settle. She knew the target on her back had grown exponentially. She ordered the immediate preparation of her fleet. Every document, every treaty, and every piece of intelligence that could be salvaged was loaded into the holds. The departure was chaotic. As she stood on the deck of her ship, watching the horizon, she felt the weight of a closing door. The security she had built in Rome was gone. She pushed the rowers to their limits, cutting through the Mediterranean with a singular, desperate focus. Behind her, the Roman Republic was tearing itself apart. She reached Alexandria, but the city she returned to was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fortress waiting for a siege that had already begun. The summons from Mark Antony arrived with the weight of an ultimatum, yet she viewed it as an opening. She would not travel as a subordinate seeking favor. She would arrive as a force that could not be ignored. In the shipyards of the Nile, she commissioned a vessel that defied the conventions of the sea. The hull was crafted to gleam, and the oars were fashioned from polished metal that caught the sun, turning every stroke into a rhythmic flash of light. The sails were dyed a deep, striking hue that dominated the horizon long before the ship reached the harbor. As the barge cut through the waters toward Tarsus, the sound of flutes and lyres drifted across the waves, creating an atmosphere that felt less like a diplomatic mission and more like the arrival of a deity. On the docks, the Roman legions stood in formation, but as the vessel pulled alongside the pier, the soldiers broke their rigid posture to watch. When she stepped onto the gangplank, she did not look toward the Roman commander with hesitation. She looked at him as an equal. The impact was immediate. By the time the sun set on Tarsus, the foundation for a decade-long alliance had been poured. The Roman general became her partner. Octavian's campaign was no longer fought with words in the Roman Forum. It had moved to the open water. His propaganda had successfully isolated them, painting their alliance as a betrayal of the Republic, and now he brought the full weight of his legions to enforce that narrative. The confrontation at Actium began with the thunder of catapults and the splintering of wood. The sea turned into a chaotic theater of fire. As the ships collided, the air grew thick with the smell of pitch and burning timber. Cleopatra watched from the deck of her flagship as the lines of their fleet began to buckle. The maneuverability they had relied upon was negated by the sheer aggression of the Roman blockade. One by one, the vessels caught fire, the flames licking up the masts. Realizing the battle was lost, she signaled for the retreat. The order was a bitter pill, a final admission that the Grand Alliance could not withstand the tide of Octavian's ambition. They turned their remaining ships away from the carnage, leaving the burning wreckage behind. The journey back to Alexandria was silent. The gates of the city closed behind them, but the safety they sought was an illusion. The siege was no longer a threat on the horizon. It was now the only reality left. The messenger arrived with a lie that would end a dynasty. He told Antony that the queen was dead, and the weight of the news shattered the last of his resolve. Antony did not wait to verify the truth. He drew his blade and fell upon it, the metal finding its mark with a final sickening thud. He died in the belief that he had lost everything. When the truth reached the palace, the silence that followed was heavier than any cry of grief. Cleopatra stood in the center of the chamber, listening to the approach of Octavian's forces. She knew the terms of her defeat. She would be paraded through the streets of Rome, a trophy to be mocked, her sovereignty stripped away until nothing remained but the memory of her name. She refused the chains. She walked to the stone basin where the container had been placed, the lid heavy and cold to the touch. The creature inside was small, its movement barely a ripple in the dark. She did not hesitate. She reached into the vessel, her pulse steady, her gaze fixed on the horizon of a world that no longer had a place for her. The sting was sharp. She sat back against the stone, the poison doing its work with ruthless efficiency. The Pharaonic era did not end with a battle, but with this single, calculated defiance. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Outside, the city of Alexandria held its breath, unaware that the final link to an ancient world had just been severed. The Pharaonic era did not merely fade. It collapsed in an instant, leaving a void that would be filled by the encroaching shadow of Rome. History often records the fall of empires through the lens of battlefield statistics. But here, the end was defined by the quiet stillness of a single room. The sands of Egypt, which had witnessed the rise and fall of countless dynasties, settled over the memory of her reign. She had navigated the treacherous currents of Mediterranean politics for decades, not as a pawn, but as a strategist who understood that the survival of her kingdom depended on her ability to outmaneuver the most powerful men of her time. Her death marked the closing of a chapter that had spanned 3,000 years. Yet, the narrative that followed would be written by the victors, who sought to obscure her intellect behind the veil of legend. They would speak of her as a tragic figure, a woman defined by her associations rather than her actions. But the truth remains etched in the administrative records, the diplomatic treaties, and the survival of the intellectual heart of Alexandria. She was the final shield of a culture that had stood against the tide of history until it could stand no more. Her legacy is not found in the myths of beauty that have persisted for centuries, but in the fierce, calculated protection of a sovereign state. She fought to preserve the autonomy of her people against the relentless expansion of a republic that demanded total submission. As the sun set over the Nile, the world she had governed became a province, but the weight of her defiance remained. She was the last sovereign of a dying world, and her story serves as a reminder that history is not just what is written, but what is fought for until the final breath.